The morning of June 19th, 1944 began without warning for the Japanese pilots climbing into their cockpits at Guam. They had been told the numbers. They had been shown the charts. Their commanders had stood before them in the pre-dawn hours and explained, with the measured confidence of men who believed their own intelligence, that the American carriers waiting beyond the horizon were outgunned, outranged, and exposed. The pilots believed them. They had been trained to believe them. The Zero was faster than anything the Americans had put in the air in 1941. The Type 99 carrier bomber had sunk ships at Pearl Harbor that the United States Navy was still trying to replace. And the new aircraft coming off Japanese production lines, the Mitsubishi Zero Model 52, the Yokosuka D4Y Suisei, had been specifically engineered to exceed whatever the Americans were flying now. What the pilots climbing into their cockpits at Guam did not know, what their commanders had not told them, and in some cases genuinely did not know themselves, was that the Americans had spent 2 years and $200 million solving a problem those pilots were about to discover the hard way. By 9 o'clock that morning, 243 Japanese aircraft had been shot out of the sky. By afternoon, the number would reach 376. American pilots, watching the slaughter from their cockpits, would call it the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviation, the force that had opened the Pacific War at Pearl Harbor, that had sunk HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse in open ocean, that had dominated the sky from Rabaul to Ceylon, was effectively destroyed in a single day. The commanders who had shown those pilots the charts were not wrong about their aircraft. They were wrong about what was waiting for those aircraft. And the reason they were wrong was a decision made 4 years earlier in a Grumman engineering office on Long Island, New York, by a man named Leroy Grumman, who looked at what Japan was building and decided that the only honest answer was to start over from beginning. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what Leroy Grumman built, you first have to understand what he was building against. The Mitsubishi A6M0, known to American pilots as the Zeke, had entered service with the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1940. By the standards of any air force in the world at that moment, it was a revelation. The Zero weighed 4,000 pounds empty. For an aircraft of its size, that was extraordinarily light, the result of an engineering philosophy that treated every unnecessary ounce as a moral failure. The wings were built without self-sealing fuel tanks. The cockpit carried no armor plate behind the pilot's seat. There was no system to prevent the fuel from igniting when a bullet found it. Every gram saved on protection went into performance, and the performance it brought was stunning. The Zero could climb at over 3,000 feet per minute. Its turning radius at low speed was tighter than anything in the American inventory. Its range, more than 1,800 miles with a drop tank, gave it reach that American aircraft designers considered almost implausible. When Lieutenant Commander John Thatcher of the United States Navy first received the intelligence reports on the Zero in 1941, he read them twice and then told his superiors that if the reports were accurate, the American Grumman F-4F Wildcat, the Navy's frontline fighter, could not defeat it in a one-on-one engagement. His superiors told him the reports were probably exaggerated. Japanese engineering, the assumption ran, was derivative. Their aircraft were copies of Western designs. Nothing coming out of Nagoya could genuinely outperform what Douglas and Grumman and Vought were producing on the American East Coast. That assumption lasted until December 7, 1941, when the Zero appeared over Pearl Harbor and performed exactly as the intelligence reports had described. The shock inside American aviation circles was genuine. In the first 6 months of Pacific War, the Zero downed American aircraft at ratios that, in some engagements, exceeded 10-to-1. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942, Wildcat pilots learned to avoid turning fights with the Zero at any cost. At Midway, Marine Corps Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats flew against Zeros and were massacred. The commander of the Marine Fighter Squadron at Midway, Major Floyd Parks, was killed in the first minutes. Of the 25 fighters that rose to intercept the Japanese strike, only 10 returned to the airfield. The United States Navy understood by the summer of 1942 that it had a fundamental problem. Not a problem of tactics alone, though tactics mattered. Not a problem of pilot training alone, Though that mattered too. It had a hardware problem. The aircraft it was asking young men to climb into and fly against the Zero was outclassed in the specific performance categories that determine survival in a dogfight: rate of climb, turning radius, and speed at altitude. What the Navy needed was a new fighter, not an improvement on the Wildcat, a replacement, something designed from the beginning to beat the Zero rather than cope with it. The contract went to Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, New York. And the man who would carry that contract to completion was the same man who had built the Wildcat, the same man who had been watching with professional alarm as the intelligence on the Zero accumulated through 1940 and 1941. Leroy Grumman was 50 years old when the contract arrived. He had founded his company in 1929 in a garage on Long Island with 7 employees and a borrowed set of machine tools. He had built Grumman into one of the Navy's primary suppliers through a simple philosophy: build aircraft that could absorb punishment, that could come home damaged, that could keep their pilot alive when the machine around them was failing. The Wildcat, for all its inferiority to the Zero in performance, had demonstrated one quality that the Zero lacked entirely. It was hard to kill: the self-sealing tanks, the armor plate, the ability to absorb multiple hits and remain flyable. American pilots who had survived Zero attacks owed their lives not to outmaneuvering their opponents, but to the fact that their aircraft refused to burn when it was shot. Leroy Grumman understood that the next aircraft needed to keep that quality and add something the Wildcat never had: the raw performance to choose its own terms of engagement. The design process that produced the F-6F Hellcat began in the summer of 1941. Before Pearl Harbor, before American pilots had engaged the Zero in combat, based entirely on intelligence reports and the judgment of engineers who read those reports and believed them. By December 1941, when the war began, Grumman already had preliminary designs on paper. By June of 1942, the first prototype was flying. The Navy test pilots who flew it came back with reports that circulated through Bethpage like news of a battle won. The XF-6F-1, as the prototype was designated, was not yet what it needed to be. The engine, a Wright R 2600 Cyclone producing 1600 horsepower, was powerful but not powerful enough. The climb rate was good but not decisive. The speed was adequate but not dominant. Grumman looked at the test results and made a decision that would define the Hellcat's entire character. He would not refine the existing design incrementally. He would go back to the engine. In August of 1942, Grumman replaced the Wright Cyclone with the Pratt & Whitney R 2800 Double Wasp. The Double Wasp was an 18-cylinder, 2-row radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower, the most powerful engine available for a single-engine fighter in 1942. It was the same engine powering the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt over Europe, and it transformed the Hellcat the way an entirely new heart transforms a body. With the Double Wasp, the Hellcat's top speed reached 376 miles per hour. Its rate of climb reached 3,440 feet per minute. Its surface ceiling reached 37,300 feet, 2,000 feet higher than the Zero could comfortably operate. And unlike the Zero, which had been engineered to the edge of what its structure could handle, the Hellcat had been engineered with margins. Margins for the pilot to survive when the aircraft was hit. Margins to the airframe to handle maneuvers that would tear apart a more delicate design. Margins that would matter in the kind of sustained, grinding, high-intensity combat that the Pacific War was producing in unprecedented quantities. But speed and climb rate and ceiling were not the only numbers that mattered. They were not even the most important numbers. The most important number was one that did not appear in any performance specification and was not measured in any wind tunnel. It was the number of hours it took to train a pilot who could use those specifications to actually win a fight. This is where the story of the Hellcat becomes something more than the story of an aircraft. It becomes the story of a system. Because Leroy Grumman and the engineers at Bethpage had not only designed an aircraft that was superior to the Zero in performance, they had, whether by intention or by the internal logic of their design philosophy, created a machine that was radically easier to train pilots to fly well. The Zero required exceptional pilots. It rewarded exceptional pilots. In the hands of the men who had trained for years in the pre-war Imperial Navy, it was devastating. But those exceptional pilots were not unlimited. Japan had entered the war with approximately 3,500 naval aviators. The losses at the Coral Sea at Midway, in the grinding attrition of the Solomons campaign, had cut that number by more than half by the end of 1942. Japan's training pipeline, designed for the pre-war peacetime Navy, could not replace pilots at the rate the war was consuming them. By contrast, the United States had responded to Pearl Harbor by building a pilot training program of industrial scale. Between 1942 and 1944, American flight schools graduated more than 84,000 military pilots. Not all of them were destined for carrier aviation, but the pipeline was producing trained men faster than Japanese anti-aircraft fire could remove them from the war. Into that pipeline, Grumman had inserted an aircraft that a competent pilot, trained to a standard that American schools could realistically achieve in 18 months, could fly effectively in combat. Not perfectly. Exceptional pilots still flew the Hellcat better than ordinary pilots. But the gap between what an exceptional Hellcat pilot could do and what a competent Hellcat pilot could do was narrower than the equivalent gap in Zero. A Zero flown by an average pilot against a Hellcat flown by an average pilot was no longer the guaranteed Japanese victory it would have been in 1941. The Hellcat's cockpit was designed with instruments placed where they could be read quickly in combat. The landing gear retraction was simple and reliable. The aircraft responded predictably to control inputs, without the sudden vicious departure characteristics that made some high-performance fighters kill their own pilots on approach to the carrier. The armor behind the pilot's seat, the self-sealing fuel tanks, the structural margins that let the Hellcat absorb hits and keep flying, all of these reduced the cognitive load on a pilot who was already managing the extraordinary stress of carrier combat. Less of his attention had to go to keeping the aircraft alive. More of it could go to fighting. Production began in earnest in October of 1942. The first production Hellcats reached operational squadrons in January of 1943. By June of 1943, Fighter Squadron 9, aboard USS Essex, took the Hellcat into combat for the first time in raids over Marcus Island. The early results suggested the designers had solved the right problem. By the end of 1943, Grumman and its subcontractors, including the Eastern Aircraft Division of General Motors, were producing Hellcats at a rate that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. The Bethpage factory ran 3 shifts. The Linden, New Jersey plant that Eastern Aircraft had converted from automobile production added more. By the time the critical battles of 1944 arrived, American carriers were not carrying a handful of Hellcats alongside other fighter types. They were carrying air wings composed almost entirely of Hellcats, flown by pilots who had trained for this aircraft, who knew its strengths and limitations, who had spent hundreds of hours learning how to use a performance advantage against the specific tactics that Japanese pilots employed. The numbers that resulted from this investment were so lopsided that historians have struggled to find adequate language for them. In the first 3 months of 1944, American carrier pilots flying Hellcats established a kill ratio against Japanese fighters that exceeded 13-1. In some individual engagements, the ratio was higher. Japanese pilots who had dominated the air over the Pacific in 1941 and 1942 were now flying against an aircraft they could not outclimb, could not outrun at altitude, and could not destroy with the first burst of fire because the machine they were shooting at refused to catch fire the way they expected. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What the Japanese were encountering in the skies of 1944 was not merely a better fighter. It was a physical expression of a decision made in an engineering office on Long Island when most Americans were still debating whether the intelligence reports about the Zero were accurate. Leroy Grumman had looked at what Japan was building, believed the evidence, and concluded that the only way to answer it was to design an aircraft that removed the Zero's advantages one by one. The advantage of lighter weight was answered by raw power. 2,000 horsepower could carry protection that a 1,600 horsepower engine could not. The advantage of superior climb rate was answered by the double WASP performance at altitude, where the Hellcat's supercharger maintained power that the Zero's engine began to lose above 20,000 feet. The advantage of turning radius was answered by a tactical doctrine developed by Lieutenant Commander Thatch and refined through 2 years of combat experience, that instructed Hellcat pilots to fight in pairs, to use altitude and speed rather than turning radius, to never allow themselves to be drawn into the slow, circling, turning fight that the Zero was designed to win. Japanese commanders understood, by the early months of 1944, that something had changed in the air over the Pacific. The exchange rates that had sustained their air power through the first 2 years of the war were gone. Pilots were not returning from missions at the rate they once had. Aircraft that should have come home damaged were instead not coming home at all. The training pipeline that was supposed to produce replacements was producing pilots who lasted, in some cases, only weeks before they too did not return. Admiral Jisaburo Zawa, commanding the first mobile fleet in the spring of 1944, knew the numbers. He knew what they meant. He also knew that the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo expected him to fight. Operation Ego, the plan for a decisive naval battle in the Philippine Sea, called for his carriers to sortie and engage the American fleet covering the invasion of the Marianas. The plan depended on land-based aircraft from Guam and Tinian, and Rota supplementing his carrier air wings, catching the Americans between two fires, overwhelming their fighter defenses with numbers that could offset the quality gap that was now obvious to anyone who read the engagement reports honestly. What Ozawa could not know, was that the land-based aircraft he was counting on had largely been destroyed in preliminary American strikes in the days before the battle. What arrived over the American fleet on the morning of June 19th was not a coordinated attack supported by hundreds of land-based aircraft. It was a carrier air wing stripped of that support, flying against a combat air patrol of Hellcats that had been waiting, fully fueled, fully armed, directed by radar controllers on the American carriers who would see the incoming Japanese formations from 150 miles away and vector their fighters to meet them at altitude, with speed, with the sun behind them before the Japanese pilots even knew they had been detected. The geometry of that encounter, the Hellcats meeting the Japanese formations while they were still 40 miles from the American fleet, turning what should have been an attack into an ambush before it reached its target, was not accidental. It was the product of radar and radio and the tactical doctrines that American pilots had been practicing for months. But none of it would have worked if the aircraft responding to those radar vectors had not been able to reach the intercept point before the Japanese formation did, had not been able to climb to altitude while the Japanese were still at lower height, had not been able to sustain a fight at the altitudes where the Zero's engine began to lose performance. The Double Wasp made that possible. Leroy Grumman's decision in August of 1942 to reject the original engine and start over with a more powerful one made that possible. The production lines at Bethpage and Linden that turned out aircraft faster than combat consumed them made that possible. And the 84,000 pilots trained by American flight schools, men competent to fly the Hellcat effectively even if they would never be the equal of the pre-war Japanese aces, made it possible in the only way that ultimately mattered. At scale, in sufficient numbers, on the day the battle was actually fought. By noon on June 19th, the Japanese strike waves had been destroyed. The aircraft that reached the American fleet, the fraction that survived the combat air patrol, faced anti-aircraft fire from the most densely armed naval formation ever assembled. 22 ships, each carrying radar-directed guns capable of filling the air with exploding shells at precisely the altitude where aircraft flew. Of the aircraft that penetrated the fighter defense, most were destroyed before they could release their weapons. Some released their weapons and missed. A few found their targets. The carriers Bunker Hill and Wasp were near missed. The battleship South Dakota was hit by a bomb and took casualties. The Japanese lost in exchange. 3 carriers sunk by American submarines, 376 aircraft destroyed, and somewhere between 400 and 545 irreplaceable pilots killed. The numbers were so conclusive that Admiral Spruance, reviewing them that evening aboard USS Indianapolis, described the battle in terms that suggested he was still struggling to believe the scale of what had happened. The men who were not struggling to believe it were the pilots who had been in the air. They had watched the Japanese formations come apart. They had watched aircraft fall at rates that made some of them feel something close to unease, as if the slaughter had exceeded what was necessary and moved into something else. They had performed on that day a military function so complete that it effectively ended a phase of the Pacific War. Japanese carrier aviation had never been a small or fragile force. It had attacked Pearl Harbor with 353 aircraft from 6 carriers. It had maintained air superiority over theater that stretched from the Indian Ocean to the Central Pacific for the first 6 months of the war. The loss of that force, not in a single dramatic reversal, but in the cumulative attrition of Coral Sea, Midway, the Solomons, and now the Philippine Sea, was a result of choices made on both sides of the Pacific over 3 years of war. But the decisive instrument of its final destruction, the tool that made June 19th what it was rather than the close, brutal, ambiguous engagement it might have been if the Americans had still been flying Wildcats, was an aircraft that Leroy Grumman had begun designing before the war started, that his engineers had pushed to production in 11 months, that his factories had built at a pace that Japanese industry could not match, and that the American training system had distributed into the hands of enough pilots to use it everywhere it was needed at once. The Hellcat did not win the Battle of the Philippine Sea by itself. No single weapon wins battles by itself. The radar that saw the Japanese formations at 150 miles, the submarines that sank 3 of Ozawa's carriers before the aircraft even reached the fleet, the fuel logistics that kept the American task force operational across thousands of miles of open ocean, the intelligence that told Admiral Spruance where to position his ships, all of it contributed to what happened on June 19th. But strip away any of those elements and the battle changes. Strip away the Hellcat. Replace it with a Wildcat or any aircraft that could not climb faster than Zero, could not outrun it at altitude, could not survive the first burst of fire and keep fighting. And the 376 aircraft Japan lost that day do not fall in the interception zone 40 miles from the fleet. They reach the carriers. They find their targets. The battle becomes something different. What Leroy Grumman had understood, sitting in his office in Bethpage with intelligence reports on his desk in 1941, was that the Zero was not a mystery. It was a set of engineering choices, and every engineering choice involves a trade-off. The Zero's designers had traded protection for performance. They had traded structural margin for turning radius. They had traded pilot survivability for range and agility. Those choices produced an extraordinary aircraft in 1940, when the war began and pilots with years of training took them into combat. But war is not fought in the year it begins. It is fought across time, and the trade-offs that make an aircraft excellent in its first engagements can become liabilities as the war extends, and the pool of exceptional pilots who can exploit those trade-offs is consumed by attrition. The Zero required pilots who could fly it at its limits. Grumman had designed an aircraft that did not ask pilots to operate at their limits, simply to survive. The official Navy assessment, released after the war, credited the Hellcat with destroying 5,156 enemy aircraft in combat. The kill ratio across all engagements in which the Hellcat participated was 19-1. Those numbers represent a margin of dominance that has almost no equivalent in the history of aerial combat. The pilots who flew the Hellcat did not, for the most part, know the numbers while they were flying. They knew whether the aircraft responded when they asked it to climb, whether it accelerated in a dive when they needed speed, whether it came home after taking damage that should have been fatal. The numbers came later, compiled by analysts working through gun camera film and engagement reports and the careful, brutal accounting of who had not come back. What they added up to was an answer to the question Leroy Grumman had been working on since before the war began: whether it was possible to design an aircraft that could be built in sufficient numbers, flown by pilots trained in achievable time, capable of defeating a machine that had been optimized for individual performance at the expense of everything else. On the morning of June 19, 1944, over the Philippine Sea, 376 Japanese aircraft answered that question. The answer had not come cheaply, and it had not come quickly, and it had not come without the kind of institutional resistance that greets any idea large enough to threaten the assumptions already in place. When Grumman submitted the initial Hellcat design to the Bureau of Aeronautics in the summer of 1941, the reception was not hostile. It was something more difficult to work against: polite skepticism wrapped in procedural delay. The Navy had its procurement calendar. It had its testing requirements. It had officers who had spent careers evaluating aircraft and who brought to the Hellcat the same measured caution they brought to everything else. The Wildcat was performing adequately. The Corsair Vought's gull-wing fighter was already in development and showing extraordinary speed numbers in early trials. Why the urgency? Why the demand to compress timelines that existed for good reasons? Grumman's engineers understood the urgency because they had read the intelligence and believed it when others had not. Charles Tilgner, the Hellcat's chief designer, had spent months analyzing every scrap of information available on the Zero's performance envelope. He had read the reports from Claire Chennault's American Volunteer Group in China, pilots who had fought against Japanese aircraft over Chinese cities, and sent back observations that painted a picture of an opponent unlike anything American factories were producing. He had studied the accounts from British pilots who had encountered Japanese aircraft over Malaya and Singapore and survived to describe what the experience was like. And he had done the engineering arithmetic that translated those performance descriptions into specifications and compared those specifications against what the Wildcat could do. The arithmetic was not close. It was not a matter of refinement. It was a matter of category. The Wildcat was not slightly inferior to the Zero. It was inferior in the specific qualities that determined the outcome of the fight that happened most often in Pacific combat. The low-altitude, low-speed turning engagement with the Zero's lighter weight and tighter turning radius gave an advantage that no tactic could fully compensate for. Thatch's weave, the defensive formation that John Thatch had developed specifically to protect Wildcat pilots from Zero attacks, was brilliant and it saved lives. But it was a defensive response to a hardware disadvantage. It kept pilot alive. It did not give him the ability to dominate the engagement, to choose when to fight and when to disengage, to climb above the threat and attack from altitude on terms they controlled. Tilgner needed to give the Hellcat that ability. He needed to turn the engagement geometry from something that favored the attacker into something that favored the Hellcat pilot, regardless of who had initiated the fight. And the engine changed to the Pratt & Whitney double Wasp. That decision made in compressed urgency of August 1942 was a single modification that made it possible. The double Wasp produced 2,000 horsepower at takeoff. It maintained over 1,600 horsepower at 23,000 feet through a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that compressed the thin air at altitude into something the engine could actually burn. The Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine, producing just over 1,100 horsepower at sea level, lost power progressively above 15,000 feet as the air thinned and the single-stage supercharger struggled to compensate. By 25,000 feet, the Zero was operating at a significant fraction of its sea-level performance. The Hellcat, by contrast, was still producing the power the double Wasp was designed to deliver at altitude. This meant that a Hellcat pilot who understood his aircraft could simply climb. He could take the fight vertical, above the altitude where the Zero was comfortable, and engage from a position where the performance differential that the Zero relied on had been reversed. The Zero could turn tighter at low altitude. The Hellcat could climb faster at high altitude, could sustain higher speeds at altitude, and could dive away from any engagement it chose not to continue. The fundamental equation of the dogfight, which had favored the Zero since Pearl Harbor, had been inverted. But inverting the equation in the air required first solving a different equation on the ground, the equation of production. Because an aircraft that exists in prototype form or in the hands of a single squadron does not change the course of a war. It proves the concept. The war is changed by the same aircraft in the hands of 2,000 pilots, then 5,000, then 10,000, flying from carriers that stretch across an ocean in sufficient numbers to be everywhere the Japanese needed to be stopped at once. The Grumman plant at Bethpage, in the years before the war, had been a facility of modest scale. It had produced naval aircraft in the dozens, then the hundreds. It had been designed for careful, high-skill manufacturing, the kind of production that built aircraft one at a time with craftsmen who knew every rivet and every weld. That production model could not build enough Hellcats to win the Pacific War. The war required something different. Industrial manufacturing at a scale that American industry had never applied to military aviation before 1941. The transformation of Bethpage between 1942 and 1944 was as significant an engineering achievement as anything that happened in the design office. Production engineers redesigned the assembly sequence to allow less skilled workers to perform tasks that had previously required experienced aircraft mechanics. Jigs and fixtures were built that held components in precise alignment, while workers who had been assembling automobiles 6 months earlier installed them correctly without needing to understand the engineering behind the specification. Sub-assemblies were standardized and pre-built, so that the main assembly line received finished components ready to install rather than raw stock requiring individual fabrication. Eastern Aircraft. The General Motors division that had been building Wildcats under license since 1942 applied the same logic to Hellcat production at its plant in Linden, New Jersey. General Motors understood mass production. It had built millions of automobiles on lines designed for exactly this kind of high-volume, standardized output, and it brought that knowledge to aircraft manufacture with results that industry observers described as transformative. The Linden plant was producing Hellcats at a rate that matched Bethpage within months of beginning production, and the combined output of both facilities was overwhelming the capacity of the Navy's logistics system to distribute the aircraft to the carriers that needed them. By the spring of 1944, the numbers had accumulated to something the Japanese had no framework to comprehend. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the war with 6 fleet carriers and the most highly trained carrier air groups in the world. It had built its aviation strategy around quality. A small number of exceptional pilots flying exceptional aircraft, conducting precise, coordinated strikes that overwhelmed opponents through superior skill. That strategy had worked at Pearl Harbor, at the Indian Ocean, at the early engagements of the Coral Sea. It required, as its foundation, that the pilots survive to fight again, that the experience accumulated in combat be preserved and transmitted, that the extraordinary training which produced the pre-war aces be continued at a rate that kept the force whole. The strategy had one vulnerability. It could not absorb losses. The pipeline that produced pilots capable of flying to zero at its limits required years, not months. It required candidates who could survive a training program that killed a significant fraction of those who attempted it, not through enemy action, but through the sheer demands of flying high-performance aircraft to their limits in all conditions. Japan had been producing those pilots for a decade before the war began. It could not produce them faster simply because the war required more of them. American production of trained pilots had no such constraint because American aircraft, and specifically the Hellcat, had no such training requirement. The combat that unfolded over the Philippine Sea on June 19th. 1944 was not fought between equal pilots in equal aircraft. It was fought between Japanese pilots of diminishing experience, flying the same aircraft their predecessors had flown in 1941, against American pilots of adequate competence, flying an aircraft specifically designed to give adequate competence a decisive advantage over exceptional skill in a deteriorated zero. The Japanese pilots who climbed into their aircraft that morning were not cowards. They were not incompetent. Some of them were veterans of campaigns that had produced aerial combat skills that the best American pilots would have respected. They flew toward the American fleet knowing the odds were against them, knowing that the losses of the previous 2 years had left their air groups a fraction of the strength they had once possessed, knowing that the land-based aircraft that were supposed to support their attack had not materialized in the numbers the plan had promised. They flew anyway, because they had been ordered to and because the culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy did not offer alternatives to men who had been given a mission. What met them 40 miles from the American fleet was organized, radar-directed, numerically overwhelming, and fly an aircraft that their own zero could not defeat in engagements that developed. The Hellcats that rose to intercept had altitude. They had speed. They had the vectors from the radar controllers that placed them exactly where they needed to be. And they had, beneath all of it, the accumulated decisions of 3 years. The decision to believe the intelligence on the zero, the decision to replace the engine, the decision to build on industrial lines rather than craft lines, the decision to train pilots in sufficient numbers to be everywhere at once rather than in sufficient skill to be extraordinary somewhere. 376 aircraft. In a single day. The pilots who flew them were not coming back. The carriers that had launched them were, within hours, sliding beneath the Philippine Sea as American submarine torpedoes found their engineering calculations and rendered them irrelevant. Japan would build more aircraft. It would train more pilots, after fashion, but would never again assemble a carrier air arm capable of challenging American naval aviation for control of the Pacific sky. The force that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had sunk the Prince of Wales, that had for 6 months made the Pacific an ocean where the rising sun flew unchallenged, was gone. Leroy Grumman lived until 1982. He received the Navy Distinguished Public Service Award and saw his company become one of the defining aerospace manufacturers of the 20th century, building aircraft for decades after the war ended. He was not a man given to grand pronouncements about his own work. The engineers who worked for him described a leader who thought in terms of problems and solutions rather than legacies and monuments, a man who wanted to know whether the aircraft worked and whether the pilot came home. The pilots came home. Not all of them. The Pacific War consumed American lives in numbers that resist easy summary, and Hellcat pilots were not exempt from the arithmetic of combat. But they came home at rates that no one who had flown the Wildcat against the Zero in 1942 had thought possible. The kill ratio, 19-1 across the Hellcat's combat career, was not a statistic that emerged from exceptional pilots performing exceptional feats. It was a statistic that emerged from adequate pilots, in adequate numbers, flying an aircraft designed to make adequacy sufficient. That is what Leroy Grumman had understood in his office in Bethpage in 1941. Reading intelligence reports that his contemporaries were still debating the accuracy of. The Zero was not unbeatable. It was a set of trade-offs and trade-offs of consequences, and the consequences compound across time and attrition, and the grinding mathematics of industrial war. The aircraft that reversed those trade-offs, that chose power and protection and producibility over the razor-edge performance that made the Zero extraordinary and fragile, was already taking shape on Long Island, while Pearl Harbor was still burning. On June 19, 1944, over water that Japanese admirals had believed, with genuine reason, would remain under their control, 376 aircraft fell. The Pacific was not theirs anymore. It had stopped being theirs the moment the double Wasp turned over for the first time in a Hellcat on a test stand in Bethpage, New York, and the numbers that would decide the war began their inexorable accumulation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.